Good morning, everyone. It's so exciting. Okay, welcome to Direct Action Training. This is sponsored by WinRed. If you didn't see their presentation on Wednesday, they are the latest and greatest in fundraising for conservative candidates and efforts. I'm excited to set up my landing page for my favorite candidates so I can raise money for them. I encourage you all to do the same thing. You can go to winred.com to see more about that. My name is Holly Turner. I'm with Stampede Consulting. We recruit, train, and hire and deploy military veterans across the country for conservative candidates and causes to help campaigns. We knock on doors, we send text messages, we make phone calls, and we create chaos. Right? The left has been doing that for a long time, so now we're doing that as well. So today is one of my favorite topics. It's the Second Amendment. And we're going to be, we're going to be talking about what we can do as conservatives going into the 2020 election. What do we need to know? Excuse me. What do we need to know? What talking points can we have? What are the most persuasive messages that we can use when we're talking to people who are not necessarily on our side? It may be a waste of time to get into a screaming match with the crazy left, but there are a lot of people in this country that are in the middle. They're not really sure what they feel about this issue. They hear a lot from the media. And so we're going to talk about some common sense things that we can do to have an open and honest discussion with them. So I'm very excited to introduce our two guests today. And also real quickly, Clayton in the back of the room here, if you have a question for our guest, Clayton, just wave your hand at Clayton. He'll bring a piece of paper over to you. You can jot it down and he'll bring it up here and we'll ask our guests. This is going to be available via podcast download and it is being live streamed on the CPAC website. So if you want to send this around to your family and friends later, that would be great because there's going to be some good information in here. So without further ado, my guests. First of all, Glen Caroline. Glen is a 29-year veteran of the National Rifle Association. Do we have any members in here of the National Rifle Association? Okay, that's great. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for doing that. Their work is so important. And if you're not a member, please see Glen afterwards. Glen serves as the managing director of the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action's grassroots programs and field campaign operations division. So Glen is boots on the ground when it comes to this issue. He and his team talk to thousands of people every single day. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say, Glen. Glen develops and implements all of NRA's political and legislative grassroots programs, as well as the association's campaign field operations, voter registration drives, get out the vote campaigns at the national, state, and local level. Glen has represented the NRA in more than 600 speeches, debates, which is good to know, and public forums. So we're excited to hear what you have to say, Glen. Welcome. Erica Tergeson Road is the director of hunting and policy at the NRA. How long have you been there, Erica?
In my current capacity, 3 years.
3 years, okay.
But I did another tour of duty as a federal lobbyist for NRA as well.
But a lifelong Second Amendment supporter, correct?
And a lifetime member.
Okay, I love it. So Erica's work includes pushing for policies that encourage hunting, makes hunting more accessible and affordable, while also fighting against numerous anti-hunting efforts, which we know are not really anti-hunting efforts, right? They're anti-gun efforts. So we're excited to hear from you guys. So I know you have a slide deck you're going to describe for our audio audience. You're going to describe what you're showing us there. So go ahead, Glen.
Yeah, so I'll start. Let me thank you all for allowing me to come out here and participate in this, for your support of the NRA and the Second Amendment. Certainly we're having this discussion at a very relevant time because the debate over gun rights today between the presidential race and elections, it's like crazy town USA with some of the things that some of these folks are saying. Whether it's Joe Biden talking about shooting people through a door with a shotgun, or talking about things like clips and magazines and bullets and using terms interchangeably that make no sense. We need context in this debate, and we need it right now simply because of what's going on and what the people who seek to lead our country are saying. We've got the squad out there that are talking about disarmament. We have elected officials in Pennsylvania calling NRA members terrorists for our support of the Second Amendment. We have the once and former presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke talking about, hell yes, we're coming to actually confiscate your guns. So the terminology we use to counter this in the debate is very, very important. You know, you just look at the misunderstandings that people have as we try to discuss the intricacies of the debate, whether it's, you know, talking about, as I said earlier, magazines versus clips and bullets and the different types of guns. And it's something that we work very hard at the National Rifle Association to correct, because we're talking about legislation that's going to affect millions and millions of Americans. And just from a historical context, this misrepresentation, this ignorance, this distortion of the facts and the terms is nothing new. And it's a deliberate political strategy by our opponents to try to change the terms of debate, to tap into people's emotion to accomplish the disarmament campaign. A really good example is the fact that the present-day debate we have over the misnamed assault weapons and the AR-15s in particular. The AR-15 rifle has been around for decades. You know, since 1963 it was introduced, but our supporters didn't start using the terminology quote-unquote assault weapon until 1984. And there was a deliberate reason for that. I think our opponents realized very quickly when it comes to things like assault weapons that as their previous campaigns to ban handguns and other arms failed, they try to go to the low-hanging fruit. They try to capitalize on misinformation, and they try to capitalize on emotion. So I just want to read a quote because I know our listeners can't see it. But in 1988, there was a handgun activist group that recommended to their allied groups, quote, assault weapons will strengthen the handgun restriction lobby. Handgun restriction consistently remains a non-issue with the vast majority of legislators, the press, and public. Assault weapons are a new topic. The weapon's menacing looks, coupled with the public's confusion over fully automatic machine guns versus semi-automatic assault weapons. Basically, anything that looks like a machine gun is assumed to be a machine gun, can only increase the chance of public support for restrictions in these weapons. Efforts to restrict assault weapons are more likely to succeed than those to restrict handguns. So you can see the framing of the debate, the issues, the language they use is part and parcel to advance their agenda. And that's why this becomes so important. And in the current presidential debate, the lunacy isn't just limited to guns. Recently, Elizabeth Warren talked about traffic violence. Now, none of us in our right mind would talk about drunk driving or car accidents as traffic violence, but she said in a tweet that was released a few weeks ago that traffic violence kills thousands and injures even more Americans every year. On World Day of Remembrance for Traffic Crash Victims, I'm sending my love to the families and friends of those who've lost loved ones. It's time to end traffic violence. Now, just imagine commonsensically if we applied that to, you know, painters that fall off ladders. Is that now ladder violence? Or when a bakery catches on fire, somebody dies in an accident like that, is that oven violence? Or, you know, a carpenter cuts off his arm with a saw. We're now talking about saw violence. It just makes no sense, but it's part and parcel of their efforts to redefine the terms of debate, to capitalize on emotion, and to try to influence the outcome of legislation. So for all these reasons and others, the words that we use in this debate matter. And they especially matter when we're talking about attempts to pass national gun control laws that are going to affect 100 million law-abiding gun owners. Today, we're having kind of an academic discussion to prepare ourselves, but in the halls of Congress and state legislatures, the words our opponents use to win legislative battles and enact statutes have an impact and do have meaning. So I want to talk a little bit about just some strategies that we have found successful to quote-unquote win the debate or help at least educate the electorate when it comes to the gun control debate. And the first three things I want to talk about pertain to style. It's important when you're engaging with somebody who is ignorant in the truest sense of the word, that is, they just don't understand the gun control debate of guns, to demonstrate that you have some type of shared values with them. I always say every American wants to reduce gun violence, and every American wants to make sure that violent people don't have access to guns. And, you know, people on both sides of this debate have been touched by gun violence. So a good example of a shared value is anytime I do a discussion debate, I'm quick to talk about when I was 17 years old, graduating senior in high school, one of my best friends took his own life with his father's shotgun. That just because I'm a staunch supporter of the Second Amendment doesn't mean that perhaps I haven't been personally affected by some type of gun violence. And bridging that gap to show that it's not always emotion that dictates how people think, but for some of it's logic, I think it sometimes take the temperature down and at least start a productive dialogue. Shattering false stereotypes. I'm sure if we were all to conjure up what one of our opponents would basically say is a traditional NRA member or supporter, it would probably be a negative connotation we would have in our minds. It's important that we as lawful, responsible gun owners that are representative of the community as a whole shatter those types of stereotypes. We're doctors, we're lawyers, we're teachers, we work in the grocery store, we're baseball coaches like I am, we're on the PTA. We're people's neighbors and friends, and we need to let folks know that those of us who own guns, we're average Americans like everybody else. And I think when we connect peer to peer and we can erase some of those stereotypes, it leads to a much more productive discussion. And finally, as it comes to style, one word that I have found works very well with those who may not always agree with us is choice. I don't think Erica and I are up here saying that every qualified law-abiding American has to own a gun. We just want to make sure it's a viable choice for those of us who do choose to make that decision. And we don't want the government telling us that we can't. Then there's the substantive part of the debate, correcting the record, making sure that we root out fake studies and stats that don't really comport with reality, and politicians such as the ones that I just put up quotes from before that just don't know what they're talking about. Keep in mind, too, it's very hard to beat something with nothing. So in addition to opposing bad legislative proposals, we need to offer our own types of solutions. Whether it's things like enforcing the tens of thousands of existing laws that are on in the books, or our efforts to train 1 million Americans every single year on safety and responsibility, or making sure the records of those people who are prohibited by law actually have that data populated into the instant check background system, or having a serious discussion about mental health reform in this country, or laying out choices through our School Shield program where schools can choose for themselves the best defensive strategy to keep their students safe. I think it's incumbent upon us to just not always say no, but to say here are some productive solutions that we think will achieve everybody's mutual goals of reducing gun violence, but won't intrude on or impede upon law-abiding citizens' Second Amendment rights. So I want to very quickly just go through a few issues that tend to always be in the news, just to kind of put a finer point on how important it is for us to speak in the worlds of fact and reality. So assault weapons is one that we talk about very frequently. And we as educated gun owners need to be able to point out the difference to those who don't understand firearms, that there is a functional difference between a semi-automatic firearm that shoots 1 round per pull of the trigger and a true fully automatic machine gun that will repeatedly and automatically shoot bullets as long as the trigger is depressed. Because we're talking about the former. We're talking about semi-automatic firearms whose technology has been around for over a century, not fully automatic machine guns. We need to talk about the fact that the AR-15 and similar guns are the most popular rifle in the United States today. These are the commonly owned guns that we own and our neighbors own that are used for competitive shooting and hunting and self-defense and collecting. These guns aren't outliers. These guns are some of the most popularly owned rifles in the United States of America. And we need to talk about the statistical fact that if you look at the FBI, rifles are used in a tiny percentage, about 2% of all crimes, and the type of firearms mislabeled as assault weapons are only a fraction of that 2%. So these are not the guns disproportionately used or misused to commit crime.
So Glenn, what you're saying is that the left is just trying to put some emotion to these arguments. They're not based on facts at all. They're just trying to scare Americans.
At the end of the day, I think a big part of this debate boils down to emotion on one side and logic and fact on the other. And it's hard to counter emotion with fact, but when we're talking about legislating and putting laws in the books that are going to affect us, we can't act on things that make us feel good and make us feel like we've done something when in fact it's not going to achieve the goal and it may have a negative effect. It's the same thing quickly with the difference between magazines and clips. Many people use that interchangeably, and when you're out at dinner having a conversation with friends, there's not too many consequences to that. But when you're an elected official writing legislation to ban certain types of magazines or to have ammunition restrictions, it's important to know that an ammunition clip is a device used to store individual rounds together, and a magazine is what those rounds go into. We just need to be precise with our language when we're talking about legislating those types of products. And finally, universal background checks. That's a clever term. Universal background check sounds good, except for the fact that the class of individuals we want to make sure don't get guns, criminals, these checks will never be universal because they're by definition lawbreakers and they're not going to go through a background check. And we see data that I have up here right now that shows that an overwhelming majority of criminals get their guns through unregulated channels that aren't part and parcel of a background check. And we've also seen that the background check needs to be repaired because in most of these high-profile mass shootings we've seen, the individual has successfully passed a background check. So we see there's problems with the check itself. Silencers is another new...
So Glenn, let's
ahead.
talk about that real quick.
Sure.
So they're getting them through channels that are not regulated. What does that mean?
They steal them, they get them in the black market, they trade them for drugs, they get them through a straw purchase. It means somebody who is not prohibited from getting a gun gets it and then deliberately breaks the law by knowingly transferring that to somebody who's prohibited.
So those guys aren't going to
Obey by the law.
They're not going to do that.
100%.
Okay, so how do people have a background check done and pass when they shouldn't? How is that even possible?
The biggest problem in that situation is the fact there are people who have things in their records, and very often it's mental health history, that haven't been put into the system. So we support a proposal known as Fix NICS that basically says very simply, if you are prohibited by law from legally owning a gun, that record has to be part and parcel of the background check system. Because I think we'd all agree, a check is only as good as the data that go in there.
And isn't it in the case of the incident in Texas, wasn't there an issue in that shooter's background that should have been put on his record and the government just failed to do it? I mean, does the government ever make mistakes? Is that possible?
Look, 100% mistakes have been made. I think we see very often, a lot of us scratch our heads when you see that these shooters who commit these horrific crimes and you learn about their background, you start questioning, hey, why was this person not only in a position to get a gun to begin with, but why was there no intervention either through the mental health community or the criminal justice committee to get out in front of this so this person wasn't in a position to commit harm to begin with?
It's good.
So if I could just finish real quickly, I'm not going to belabor the silencers versus suppressors issue, but I do just want to show you that it is important to note that a suppressed .22 rifle is slightly less loud than an ambulance siren and only slightly louder than a jackhammer. So these James Bond movies where we hear a puff and somebody's shot and nobody knows is Hollywood. And I guarantee you most Americans have never shot a suppressed firearm, who don't know that you should probably still wear hearing protection, that don't know it still makes a pretty loud bang. And again, if we're talking among friends and you're ignorant of it, that's one thing. But when our legislators are trying to pass laws based on misinformation and falsity, that's something totally different. So in the United States today, just to give you some context, we have over 100 million gun owners who legally own about 400 million firearms. Those are all all-time highs. More handguns, more rifles, more semi-autos than ever before. Yet violent crime is still at near historic lows. Recent FBI data report about a 210% decline in 2017 from even the previous year. And between the years of 1994 and 2017, the murder rate declined by 40% and violent crime declined by 45%.
So gun ownership is increasing, crime is decreasing. That's completely opposite of what the left is telling us. Let me say it this way, and that's
a good point. Our opponent's entire argument is based on what they believe the only inevitable outcome if we have more guns and we liberalize gun control laws is that crime is going to increase. That's their entire thesis. So what we've seen in reality, we do have more guns. We do have more gun owners than ever before. We do have more Americans who are legally carrying in public than ever before. Yet we've seen a corresponding decrease in the rate of crime. So I'm not saying it's solely because there are more guns and more gun owners. All I'm saying is their suggestion that if you have more guns, you're going to have more crime has just been proven false. Yeah. So at the end of the day, what I would say before I turn it over to Erica is we all have to remember as ambassadors of the Second Amendment, and those of us who are NRA members are ambassadors of the National Rifle Association, that your words matter. The style in which you conduct yourself matters. Your tone matters. Your presentation, all of the thing matters. We have to make sure that our supporters are educated and empowered to go out and spread the gospel to others. This guy here who's literally got this tattooed on his back and it says, "I'll give up my gun when they pry it from my cold dead fingers." Our listeners can't see it, but he literally has that tattooed on his back. We need to make sure that people like that understand the facts when they're speaking to other people. Conversely, you have to realize we're never going to convince the unconvincible. Our discussion, our outreach has to be a triage method where the people who we know are always going to be with us, to make sure they stay with us, they're active, they're educated. The people who are never going to be with us, we're not wasting our time or energy and our breath trying to convert those who will never convert. But those who are in the middle, who are open to suggestion and persuasion and logic and fact, that's the sweet spot where we have to make presentations to try to make sure that we can mobilize them to be supporters of the National Rifle Association, our agenda, or at least to mitigate their hostile opposition to our position. So if you come across an open-minded person who's willing to listen to fact and willing to have a discussion by incorporating some of these talking points and some of these stylistic points, I do think when people are presented with facts and logic and common sense, they tend to gravitate to our position, and it's just about finding those people to have a conversation with and really not wasting your time with those folks who are never going to be persuaded.
Great. Thank you so much, Glen.
Thank you.
Whew. That's a lot of information.
It's like drinking from a fire hose.
It is.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Erica Tergeson. It's truly an honor to be here today at CPAC. And I did want to follow up on the one question you had about background checks. And as we said before, they're only as good as the records that are submitted to them. But the other fact is that rather than fixing the current system we have, liberals always want to use it as an excuse to pass new laws and another new restriction and another new restriction. And so they use that as an excuse rather than fixing the underlying problem that would actually help prevent some crimes in certain cases. For those of you on the podcast, I'm showing a picture that has a toddler holding a phone, and he has a pistol in the back of his diaper. And I put this up there because, sure, you can take pictures. I put this up here because we need to remember who we are, and I'll give a perfect example of this. I grew up on a ranch. I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, and I had a shotgun because I grew up with rifles and shotguns. That was very natural. And I told my roommate, who at that time worked for the George W. Bush administration, I said, just so you know, my shotgun is in my closet. Here are the shells. If you ever need it for self-defense, you're more than welcome to use it. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And that's when I realized that maybe not everybody in America grew up the same way that I did. So I think we need to recognize that while we may understand the Second Amendment well, while we may be proficient and comfortable with firearms, a lot of the public is not. So be aware of that when you start talking to people about firearms or the Second Amendment. The good news is that we have a lot in common, and the underlying premise, and again, we're not talking about the activists that really want to control not just guns, but every aspect of your life. We're actually talking about normal Americans who may not know anything about the Second Amendment and may be afraid of firearms. And they think that if they support gun control, that will protect them and that will protect their family. And if you think about it, if you give it 2 seconds, you think, well, fewer guns, fewer crimes. And that's about as much thought as I think they give it. So what we really need to do is start to get them to think about the fact that maybe these laws aren't actually protecting us. We keep passing more and more laws in states like California, for example, and guess what? They've been completely useless at preventing the type of crime that we're seeing. So if you can just sow a couple of seeds of doubt in these people that gun control is not the way to go and just get them thinking about that, then you've really started something with them. And this is just a quick reminder to everybody. I used to get in arguments all the time in my 20s. I was very passionate about the Second Amendment, and you get very upset, and that's when bad things happen. So everybody in this room and listening to the podcast, of course, is a very polite, respectful person, but this is just a reminder that you have to check your passion at the door a little bit. You need to stay calm and be respectful and empathetic and try not to get upset. And let me tell you, working for the NRA, some of the most interesting things happen. When you go to a regular social setting, you meet people either hug you and say, I'm a life member, or they throw a drink in your face because they hate you. So it can be very interesting. You really have to stay calm. It's extremely important to listen to their argument, not hear it, not think about what you're going to say next, but listen. What are they concerned about? Why are they supporting gun control? And once you listen to them, you can hit on whatever is important to them, like protecting their families, for example. We just have different ways of protecting our families. And if you look at all the legislation that's been passed, is any of this really going to protect your family? And the answer is no. Acknowledge their arguments. If they say something, as Glen said, that you agree with, acknowledge that right away so that you have common ground and credibility with them. Of course, be sincere and respond to their arguments. Again, don't get personal. It's important to make sure that they hear you, and the easiest way to do this is to have 1 or 2 very simple points. For me, I always pull the female card. I'm 5'2". I won't tell you how much I weigh, but if a man wanted to overtake me, he absolutely could. And I lived in Alexandria by myself, alone. I used to walk my dog at night by myself, and I wanted to be able to protect myself. People were robbed, mugged, murdered, murdered and raped in our area and across the country, unfortunately, all the time. And that usually works with people. Now, I will tell you this, I did run into a guy the other day, and I had no idea he was a liberal. I was just introduced to him, and he started talking about gun control. And he is talking about the Democratic debates, and I said, well, what about me, though? I'm kind of little, and I'd like to have a firearm to protect myself. And he said, well, maybe you shouldn't be hanging around with men that would rape you. And can you imagine if someone on the left said that? It's so incredibly offensive. Anyway, I'm not going to change that guy's mind, but it will tell you, and you just have to stay calm, cool, and collected and say, we just agree to disagree. Forget references to the Constitution. I love political theory. I love talking about it. I'm a geek. A lot of people in this room are the same way, but this is lost on most of the general public, as you can imagine. They don't care what the Supreme Court said. Unfortunately, they really don't care what the Constitution said. Instead, use emotion, because this is an emotional issue. It's emotion that drove them to choose to support gun control. So use emotion, again, protecting yourself to get out of that and to convince them that it's the other way that we need to go. The Second Amendment is actually really simple. It's about self-defense. It's not theoretical, it's not historical, it's a basic truth, it's a natural right, it's fundamental to all of us deep down inside in our gut. I think almost every American understands how important it is to have the right to self-defense. When our founding fathers wrote the Second Amendment, of course, they lived self-defense. They were traitors, they were radicals, they had lots of enemies that were after them all the time. They absolutely knew what they were doing when they drafted the Second Amendment. Most gun control supporters, as I said, think gun control will protect them. We're talking about a different type of way of protecting yourself, of course. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge mass shootings, which are tragedies, which are awful, which are a major, major problem that we have right now. The liberals don't get the higher moral ground because they support gun control after these tragedies. That's not right. Taking guns away from law-abiding citizens will do nothing to stop these tragedies. Quickly, some just background stats that will help you inform your argument. 2/3 of gun deaths in the United States are suicides. This is tragic. It's a huge problem, but this is not gun violence. So know that when Anytown for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action say that there are so many gun deaths in the United States every year, they are including suicide in those numbers. Rifles. Glen already talked about this, so I'll skip this, but basically the statistics out there on AR-15s, any kind of AK-47s, whatever rifle, weapons of war, shows that there are very few crimes that are actually committed with rifles, and there's no reason to further restrict them. And then really we are dealing with a mental health issue here. The NRA, we are not mental health experts. It's going to take a lot of people to solve the problem that we currently have. But I think it's important to know that in 1955, for mental health patients, there were 337 beds per 100,000 people. Now there are 12. Something is not working. There are also a lot of misperceptions, as Glen also talked about. The NRA wants everybody to own a gun. I get this all the time. Yes, we want more people to own firearms, but it's your choice. It's up to you. And it's really, the most important thing is whether you can have a firearm if you so choose. The NRA wants all school teachers to be armed in class. That's also not true. We just want them to have the ability to be armed to protect their students if they so choose. So it's fine if they don't want to own a firearm, although I would also recommend if you're proficient in shooting, take them shooting. I've taken so many people shooting before and they say, oh, that's it? Or I just shot an AR-15? Wow, I had no idea. That was not a big deal. If you can do that. Then you have to ask the really tough questions, is if you or your family were violently attacked, how would you defend yourself? And what would be your tool of choice? And when they start thinking about that, I think they start thinking a little differently. Quickly on women, basically, women are the largest growing sector of gun ownership. And the bottom line here is that a Pew Research Center survey in 2017 recorded that about a quarter of the women who own guns say protection is the only reason they own guns. I have several liberal friends who agree with me on nothing, but they own guns and they actually have their concealed carry permits because they want to protect themselves. It also said in this Pew Research Center survey that 70% of women noted that they deem the right to own guns to be an essential component of their personal sense of freedom. And that's huge. And that's what we really, when you're talking to others, especially women, what you need to talk about. A great source of information from NRA is Twitter, and it's at NRA. We have all kinds of videos that we post very quick. We point out hypocrisy with politicians. If you need any information, Twitter's quick and easy, and we do a really good job there.
And y'all are putting that on Instagram too. I follow you on Instagram, and
it's on Facebook as
great.
well.
Yeah, it's really good.
This is a quick video. I'm not going to show it, but it shows several different types of women, one of which is an immigrant from China who has her concealed carry permit. You know, it's not what people think of anymore. All different kinds of women have firearms for many different reasons, but mostly self-defense. For women, firearms are the great equalizer. As I said, I'm 5'2". You know, like a guy in junior high could probably overtake me. So it's important that we be able to defend ourselves. And then I think this is a great fundamental question, and this is where you can really take a play out of the left's playbook. They always talk about, in regards to women, you know, it's my body, it's my body. Well, if you don't have the right to protect your body, what do you have? You have nothing. And then you can ask them, what about protecting children? Even some of them may say, hey, I don't want a gun in the house. I'm not comfortable with it. Okay, fine. But what about me? I happen to be very proficient with firearms. Is it okay that I have one to protect my family? And then what about people with disabilities or the elderly? There are so many people that are in wheelchairs or have other types of disabilities that need to have firearms to protect themselves, even more so than I do. And this is an example of a gentleman whose wife is at home in a wheelchair, and the only way that she can protect herself while he's gone is with an AR-15. This is also on Twitter, and it's a great video. These are just 3 quick examples from 2019 of women who defended themselves over the past year. And I love the first one because this woman says, I saved my life. She defended herself from 5 would-be robbers, shooting at least one. The suspects did not expect her to be armed. That is really the beauty of the concealed carry revolution that we have in this country right now. Another one that I love is a woman who, it was a woman who had an ex-convict or somebody who escaped from jail, kicked in her back door, and then came into her bedroom and kicked in her bedroom door. And she shot him and defended herself. But anyway, it's so important to hear these. We never hear them in the mainstream press, of course. And the most compelling story of all for any of your friends is Savannah. And I don't know if the audio will work on this. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and play this.
My name is Savannah, and I'm here in defense of the tens of thousands of law-abiding Virginians that would be affected by the recently proposed gun control legislation. For you to understand why the Second Amendment is so important to me, I have to tell you a little more about myself. In the fall of 2016, I was living my dream. I had just begun my senior year of college in Philadelphia. I was at my dream school and only months away from the degree in neuroscience I've wanted since I was 12. But then everything fell apart. I was sexually assaulted. I'll spare you the details, but it was the worst thing that has ever happened to me. It's a well-known fact that sexual violence is prevalent on college campuses, but I bought myself a rape whistle, took as many precautions as I could, and I tucked my concerns away into the far corners of my mind. Detectives Benson and Stabler didn't swoop in and save me that night like they always do on Law & Order SVU. Instead, my soul was left shattered. Due to the trauma, I dropped out of college during my senior year and I moved back home to Norfolk, Virginia. I shut myself away in my childhood bedroom as I replayed that night over and over again in my mind. I gained about 100 pounds and my hair began to fall out due to the stress. I was later diagnosed with PTSD, a diagnosis that I am not even remotely ashamed of. I am a gun owner, and I was one at the time of my assault. I began safety training and target practice with my pop-up when I was 10 years old. But none of that mattered that day. I went to a gun-free college and chose not to bring my firearm with me. In theory, yes, I could have broken the law and carried my gun in college anyways, but I wanted to follow the rules. I am an example of gun control legislating people into victimhood, but I am not alone. Among the countless others, there's my friend Amanda Collins, who was raped at gunpoint by a monster in a campus parking garage just feet away from the police station. Her gun was at home because even though she had a concealed carry permit, her campus was a gun-free zone. Her assailant didn't follow the law, but she did. There's also my friend Nikki Gozer, who had to watch her stalker shoot and kill her late husband Ben in a gun-free zone. She too had a legally owned firearm and concealed carry permit, but her gun was locked in the car because she didn't want to break the law. Unfortunately, her stalker didn't follow the law, and now her husband Ben is dead. As I picked up the pieces of the life I once loved and settled into my new normal, I felt a moral obligation to speak out about self-defense.
And I'll leave it at that. That is on our Twitter page. But if you don't respond to that, I don't know what people will respond to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. So we're running out of time, but we do have a couple of little questions. So you guys have covered most of this. You were talking about emotion versus fact, and one of the questions was, our opponents really do focus on emotion and not fact. How do we inject emotion? And you did a great job of explaining that, Erica. It really is important. What can people do to get involved? I know they can go to Twitter. They can see talking points. Can they volunteer? Can they become a member? Are there printed outs of pages of talking points on issues? I know there are a lot of, we've got red flag logs, we've got universal background checks, we've got all sorts of possible legislation that may be out there that are real. Y'all have such good talking points on that. What should people do if they want to get involved?
Well, I think your question answered the question. All of the above. Right now, obviously, we're in a pretty important election cycle that we'll be fully engaged in. So the way I always describe it is we need our supporters to be educated on the candidates and the facts, and they need to be empowered to actually take that information and do something with it, whether it's helping us knock on doors or make phone calls or turn out the vote or write letters to the editor. But we can't leave any pro-Second Amendment voter on the table.
What's at stake this election?
Well, I think the future of the Second Amendment. If we're not able to hold the White House and the Senate and hopefully maybe do something good in the House of Representatives, if any one of the people who are running for the White House right now get in power, and God help us if we lose the Senate, I think our gun rights will be gone forever.
Yeah, so it's important, guys, really important. All right, thank you, guys. I do want to recognize Barbara Rumpel is here. This is my official endorsement, and Barbara is running for the NRA board. We need more women in representing the Second Amendment and talking about these issues like you, Erica. So Barbara's running. I would like for you all to please vote for Barbara. Glen and Erica, thank you so much for doing this. And I know somebody wants a copy of the PowerPoint too, so we'll figure out a way to get that to everyone. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.